Welcome to Deduction Junction, where mysteries unfold and every detail holds a clue. Step into the brilliant mind of Hercule Poirot, the world's greatest detective, as we journey through his most intriguing cases. With logic sharper than a razor and an eye for the smallest detail, Poirot unravels crimes that leave others baffled. Get ready to immerse yourself in a world of suspense, deception, and of course, the little gray cells. The investigation begins now. Chapter 1. The Moonlit Tragedy. The moon hung low over the ancient estate of Whitecroft Manor, its silver light casting eerie shadows along the gravel pathway that wound through the carefully manicured gardens. The great house, standing as it had, for centuries exuded an air of silent dignity. It was a place that had seen generations of laughter, secrets, and whispered scandals. Tonight, however, it bore witness to something far darker. At precisely midnight, a scream pierced the stillness. It was not the sort of scream that came from a petty quarrel or a startled dream. It was a cry of sheer terror, cut short abruptly, as though smothered. Moments later, the vast oak doors of the manor swung open, and a figure emerged, stumbling forward into the night. Lady Eleanor Marsh, the mistress of Whitecroft Manor, stood at the threshold, a hand clutched to her chest. Her eyes wide with horror, the household came alive with urgency. Lights flickered on in the upper floors, voices shouted down the corridors, and the distant sound of a clock chiming the hour punctuated the chaos. Sir Reginald Marsh, her husband, a man of broad stature and thinning hair, appeared moments later, wrapped in his dressing gown, his face a mask of confusion and concern. "What is it, Eleanor? What's happened?" His voice was gruff, but there was a hint of something else beneath it. Apprehension. Lady Eleanor turned to him, her lips trembling as she struggled to find words. At last she managed, "It's James. He's dead." A stunned silence fell upon the assembled guests, maids, and butlers who had rushed from their rooms. Then, as if on cue, a new flurry of movement erupted. People hurried to the study where James Bartlett, the Marsh family's longtime solicitor and a dear friend, had been staying during the weekend gathering. The door was ajar, and a single lamp flickered within, casting long, sinister shadows. Across the rich mahogany furniture, James Bartlett lay slumped over the great oak desk, his body motionless. A glass of brandy sat near his outstretched hand, untouched. His usually ruddy complexion had faded to an unnatural pallor, and his eyes, wide open, stared blankly into nothingness. A strangled gasp escaped one of the guests, a Miss Charlotte Denham, a refined yet sharp-eyed woman in her 40s. "My God," she whispered, clutching the folds of her silk robe. "He looks as though he was frightened to death," finished Colonel Henry Armitage, a retired military man with a stiff posture and a keen mind for observation. He bent slightly, inspecting the corpse. "But there's no sign of injury." Sir Reginald, recovering from his shock, strode forward. "We must call the police." Lady Eleanor, her hands still trembling, turned her gaze toward the tall French doors that led out into the garden. The curtains billowed slightly in the breeze. "The doors were unlocked," she murmured. "Someone was in here." Dr. Alan Weatherby, a local physician who had been staying at the manor, stepped forward to examine the body. He placed 2 fingers against the man's throat, waiting. After a few moments, he exhaled sharply. Dead, likely for an hour at least. He glanced at the untouched drink. No sign of a struggle. "It's as if he simply died." A hush settled over the room as they absorbed the weight of his words. Then, from the doorway, a quiet voice cut through the tension. "Mes amis, I believe you will find that Monsieur Bartlett did not simply die." Every head turned toward the small, impeccably dressed man standing at the threshold. Hercule Poirot, with his fastidious mustache and unmistakable air of self-assurance, stepped forward, his keen eyes sweeping the room. He was a guest of the IOI Marshes for the weekend, though few had expected he would be called upon in such a manner. "Poirot," Sir Reginald said, relief and curiosity mingling in his tone. You heard the commotion." "I heard a scream," Poirot replied, stepping closer to the desk, his gaze never leaving the lifeless face of James Bartlett. "And now, I see a man who should not be dead. Yet he is." Miss Denham let out a breath. "You think he was murdered?" Poirot tilted his head. "Ah, that is the question, is it not? What would make a man with no visible wound fall dead so suddenly? What could cause such fright, if indeed he was frightened at all?" He reached into his pocket, producing a small, gleaming magnifying glass, and leaned over the body, studying every detail with practiced precision. After a moment, he turned to the glass of brandy. He did not touch it, but he observed it keenly. Then his gaze flickered toward the open French doors. Slowly, he crossed the room, stepping out onto the terrace, his shoes crunching against the gravel pathway. He turned his eyes upward to the pale moon overhead, then down to the ground beneath. Sir Reginald, impatient as ever, followed him. "Poirot, what are you looking for?" The detective knelt, then touched something lightly with the tip of his finger. When he stood again, his expression was unreadable. "The answer, my dear sir, lies in the moonlight." Lady Eleanor shivered. "The moonlight?" Poirot nodded, as if satisfied with a private revelation. "Oui. And I believe, mes amis, that this crime, if crime it is, will not be solved by what is seen, but rather by what has been hidden." He turned back toward the gathered group, his sharp eyes resting on each of them in turn. "It is late," he said. "Tomorrow we shall begin to seek the truth. For now I suggest that everyone retire. But make no mistake, this is no ordinary death." As the household reluctantly dispersed, the weight of Poirot's words hung heavy in the air. Somewhere, amid the whispers and worried glances, a killer was listening. Chapter 2. The Gathering of Shadows. The following morning dawned pale and cold, with a mist rolling in from the lake beyond Whitecroft Manor. The vast house, normally a place of comfortable grandeur, now bore an oppressive weight, as though the very walls were absorbing the whispers of suspicion that had begun to take root. The household had stirred early, yet a hush lay over the breakfast room, where a select few had gathered, each lost in their own thoughts. Lady Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her delicate hands trembling slightly as she stirred her tea. Across from her, Sir Reginald sat stiff-backed, his jaw set, his gaze unfocused. Miss Charlotte Denham, still in her elegant nightgown and robe, sipped at her coffee, while Dr. Alan Weatherby idly drummed his fingers against the polished wood, his eyes flickering to the empty seat where James Bartlett had sat just the morning before. The silence was broken by the arrival of Colonel Armitage, who stepped into the room with his usual military precision, his eyes sharp beneath his heavy brow. "Any word from the authorities?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Sir Reginald exhaled through his nose, pushing his plate away. "Inspector Harrington is on his way from the county office. Should be here within the hour." His voice was gruff, but beneath it was a strain that no one failed to notice. Damnable thing, all of this. Charlotte Denham set her cup down with deliberate care. "It is more than damnable, Reginald. A man has died under mysterious circumstances in your house. If we are not careful, this will be a scandal of the worst sort." "Scandal?" Sir Reginald scoffed. "A man has died, Charlotte. Not a trifle." For the gossip columns, Charlotte met his gaze evenly. "And yet there are already whispers among the servants. You may wish to concern yourself with appearances, for whether we like it or not, people will talk." Before Sir Reginald could reply, the doors opened and Hercule Poirot entered, his movements precise, his expression composed. He had changed, from his evening attire into a perfectly tailored grey suit, and every inch of him was immaculate, from his polished shoes to his fastidiously arranged moustache. He cast a glance around the table, his dark eyes sharp with quiet calculation. "Bon, Martin," he said, taking the seat at the far end of the table. "I trust everyone managed to rest, though I suspect that would not be entirely true." Lady Eleanor let out a weary sigh. "How could we, Monsieur Poirot? There is a dead man in the study. None of us could sleep soundly." Poirot inclined his head. "Indeed, it is as I thought. When there is death, there is uneasiness. But it is not the house that causes unrest. It is the presence of a secret." A slight ripple of tension passed through the room. Colonel Armitage cleared his throat. "And what, exactly, do you mean by that, Poirot?" Poirot laced his fingers together, resting them neatly upon the table. "I mean, mon colonel, that a crime, if crime it is never as simple as it first appears. Monsieur Bartlett was a man of law, a solicitor, a confidant to many. He knew the affairs of those around him, did he not?" Dr. Weatherby gave a slow nod. "He handled the legal matters for many of us, yes." Poirot's gaze flickered toward Lady Eleanor, whose teacup trembled slightly in her grasp. "Madame, you were the one who discovered the body, were you not?" She swallowed hard, nodding. I was coming downstairs for a glass of water. I had heard a noise." "What sort of noise?" Poirot's tone was gentle but firm. Lady Eleanor hesitated, searching her memory. "It was odd. Not a crash, or a thud, but more of a rustling sound. At first I thought it was the wind in the trees. But then I heard the French doors rattle. I stepped out into the corridor, and that's when I heard the scream." "A scream?" Poirot's voice was thoughtful. "And you are certain it came from the study?" "Yes." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "And yet, when you arrived, the doors were open, but you saw no one." "No one." Her voice was barely above a whisper. A silence settled over the room. Poirot tapped his fingers lightly against the table before standing. "Mes amis, before the arrival of the esteemed inspector, there is one thing I must do. I must speak to those who were in this house last night, one by one. For I believe," he paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled guests, "that the truth lies not in what was seen, but in what was meant to remain unseen." With that, he turned on his heel and strode toward the study. The others exchanged uneasy glances before rising to follow. Inside the study, the morning light slanted through the curtains, illuminating the heavy oak desk where James Bartlett's lifeless form had slumped just hours before. The air was thick with the scent of brandy and old books. Poirot stood in the center of the room, his gaze sweeping every inch of the space with unwavering attention. Charlotte Denham folded her arms as she entered. "You seem very certain that something was overlooked." Poirot turned, his dark eyes gleaming. "Mademoiselle, the human mind is an extraordinary thing. It sees what it wishes to see and discards the rest. I, however, do not discard. I observe." He stepped toward the French doors, where a faint smudge lingered on the brass handle. Poirot reached into his pocket and produced a handkerchief, dabbing at the mark with delicate precision. "Curious," he murmured. Colonel Armitage stepped closer. "What is it?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned back toward the desk, his gaze falling upon the single sheet of paper that had been left undisturbed beneath James Bartlett's stiff hand. With great care, Poirot lifted it, scanning the contents. It was a simple note, a list of names, nothing more. And yet, Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. Sir Reginald frowned. What did it say? Poirot straightened, smoothing his waistcoat. "Ah, my dear Sir Reginald, it is not what it says that is important. It is why it was left behind." Before anyone could press further, the distant sound of a motor car crunching over the gravel drive signaled the arrival of Inspector Harrington. Poirot turned toward the door. "It is time, mes amis. Let us see what the good inspector makes of this affair." As they filed out of the study, a single thought settled in Poirot's mind. Somewhere among them, someone knew the truth. and sooner or later, the truth would reveal itself. Chapter 3. A tangle of alibis. The arrival of Inspector Harrington brought with it an air of officious authority. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a bristling mustache and sharp blue eyes, he exuded the no-nonsense demeanor of a man who had seen his fair share of crime and deceit. As he stepped into the grand hall of Whitecroft Manor, he removed his hat with a brusque motion and glanced around at the gathered household members. His gaze lingered on Poirot for the briefest moment before he gave a curt nod. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice gravelly, "I didn't expect to find you here." Poirot inclined his head with a small smile. "Ah, but murder has a way of drawing me in, Inspector. It is an unfortunate habit of mine." Harrington snorted, then turned to Sir Reginald. "Now then, I'll need to take statements. Start from the beginning, if you please." Sir Reginald stiffened. "We have told you the facts already, Inspector. James Bartlett was found dead in the study. It was Eleanor who discovered him." Harrington's piercing gaze settled on Lady Eleanor. "I'll need to hear it from you directly, madam." Lady Eleanor folded her hands in her lap, her knuckles white. I was going to the kitchen for a glass of water. I heard a strange sound, then a scream. When I came down, I saw the study door open, and I found him." Harrington studied her carefully. "And you saw no one leaving the study?" "No one," she whispered. Poirot, standing a few paces away, cleared his throat delicately. "And yet, Inspector, there is the matter of the French doors. They were found slightly ajar, n'est-ce pas?" Harrington frowned. "So you think someone came and went through the garden?" Poirot raised a finger. "Perhaps. But consider this, mon cher Inspector. If someone had entered through the garden, why would they leave the door open? It was a cold night. Surely one would close it behind them, no?" A murmur ran through the room. Harrington's mustache twitched. "You're saying it was meant to look like an escape route?" Poirot smiled. "Precisely, mon ami. It is what we call a misdirection." Charlotte Denham, who had been observing, quietly crossed her arms. "Then you believe someone inside the house did it?" Poirot turned his gaze upon her. "Mademoiselle, when a man dies in a locked house with only a handful of people present, logic dictates that the killer is among them." A silence settled over the group. Harrington shifted his weight. "Then I'd best establish everyone's whereabouts at the time of the murder." He took out his notepad. "What time was Bartlett last seen alive?" Dr. Weatherby adjusted his spectacles. "It must have been shortly after 10. He left the drawing room around then, saying he had some matters to review before bed." "And when was the body found?" Lady Eleanor swallowed. "A little after 11. Harrington nodded. "That gives us an hour. Right. I want each of you to tell me exactly where you were between 10 and 11. A hush fell over the room as all eyes turned toward the inspector. One by one, the members of the household spoke. Sir Reginald cleared his throat. "I was in my study, my private one, not the main study, going through estate papers." Harrington scribbled in his notebook. "Did anyone see you?" Sir Reginald hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I was alone." "Convenient," murmured Charlotte Denham. Harrington shot her a warning glance. "And where were you, Miss Denham?" Charlotte lifted her chin. "In my room, reading. I heard Lady Eleanor's scream and came running." "Did anyone see you between 10 and 11? She gave a tight smile. "No, I was alone." The inspector's jaw tightened slightly. "Dr. Weatherby?" The doctor sighed. "I was in the billiards room alone. I had a drink and then retired to my room." Harrington made a mark in his notebook. "And Colonel Armitage?" The colonel, standing with his hands behind his back, nodded firmly. "I was in the library, alone." Harrington exhaled sharply, glancing at his notes. "So, to summarize, Each of you was conveniently alone during the estimated time of death. Poirot, who had been watching the exchange with quiet amusement, spoke at last. "You see, Inspector, how interesting it is that no one saw each other. A house full of people, and yet everyone was alone?" He tapped his temple. "That, mon ami, is no coincidence." Harrington's brows furrowed. "You mean someone's lying?" Poirot gave a slight shrug. "Perhaps, or perhaps the truth has simply not yet been revealed." Sir Reginald's patience finally wore thin. "This is ridiculous. Must we go through this whole rigmarole? The man is dead. We are all disturbed by it. And now we are being treated like criminals." Poirot's expression remained neutral. "Ah, but mon cher, someone in this house is a criminal. And the truth? The truth is a clever thing. It hides in the shadows, but it never truly disappears." Harrington snapped his notebook shut. "Until we have clearer answers, I'm placing this house under watch. No one is to leave." Lady Eleanor's breath caught. "Inspector, surely it's standard procedure, Lady Eleanor." His voice was firm. "We have a man dead under suspicious circumstances, and I don't intend to let his killer slip away." Poirot inclined his head. "A wise decision." He glanced around the room. "For you see, mes amis, the murderer is not yet finished. There is something still to come." A chill passed through the air, and for the first time since the investigation began, an unmistakable sense of dread settled upon Whitecroft Manor. Chapter 4. A second visitor in the night. The heavy silence that settled over Whitecroft Manor in the wake of Inspector Harrington's declaration was like a thick fog, suffocating and absolute. The inhabitants of the grand house exchanged wary glances, their unease evident. Poirot, however, remained as composed as ever, his keen eyes missing nothing. He had seen fear before, true fear, the kind that gripped the guilty when they knew. Their secrets teetered on the edge of exposure. And he saw it now, flickering across more than one face in the dimly lit drawing room. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11. It was a curiously unsettling sound, echoing through the great house like a ghostly whisper. Poirot's moustache twitched slightly as he cast his gaze upon Lady Eleanor, who sat stiffly in an ornate chair near the fireplace. Her fingers twisted, the delicate lace of her handkerchief, her knuckles white. "Tell me, Lady Eleanor," Poirot said suddenly, his voice as soft as it was precise. "Before you discovered the body, you mentioned hearing a strange sound. Would you be so kind as to describe it?" Lady Eleanor swallowed hard. It was like a thud, a dull sound, and then a cry. Very faint." "A cry," Poirot echoed thoughtfully. "Monsieur Bartlett was already dead when you arrived, oui?" She nodded. "Yes, he was so still. His eyes." She shuddered, looking away. Poirot's gaze did not waver. "And yet you heard a cry." "How peculiar, n'est-ce pas?" Dr. Weatherby cleared his throat. "It could have been any number of things, Poirot. The wind, perhaps. The house is old and the night was not still." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, yes, the wind. It has so often been blamed for curious noises, has it not? But tell me, Doctor, did you hear it? This cry?" The doctor hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I was in the billiards room. And you, Colonel Armitage?" The retired military man exhaled sharply through his nose. "Didn't hear a thing. If there was a noise, it didn't carry to the library." Curious indeed. Poirot steepled his fingers, appearing to retreat into thought. Harrington, growing impatient, snapped his notebook shut. "All right, it's late. No sense badgering everyone now. We'll continue interviews in the morning." Poirot did not argue. He merely inclined his head as the group slowly dispersed. One by one, they retired to their rooms, casting uneasy glances over their shoulders as if fearing what might lurk in the shadowed corridors. Even Inspector Harrington eventually withdrew, though not before ensuring that 2 constables were stationed at the manor's main entrance. No one would leave without his knowledge. Alone now, Poirot took one final slow survey of the room. His gaze landed on the French doors leading to the terrace, He crossed to them, his gloved fingers running lightly along the handle. Then, with a small sigh, he turned and made his way upstairs. The night was far from over. Sometime in the small hours, long after the house had settled into an uneasy stillness, a faint creak disturbed the hush of the upper corridor. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness, moving with quiet caution. The figure paused outside a particular door, glancing both ways before slowly, carefully, pressing down on the handle. The door gave way without resistance. Inside, the moonlight filtering through the curtains cast eerie patterns across the floor. The figure stepped forward, silent, deliberate. A sharp intake of breath, then the whisper of fabric as someone shifted in the bed, a voice, barely above a murmur. "Who's there?" The intruder froze. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, quick. As a flash, a hand shot out, striking a match. The tiny flame illuminated the sharp, alert eyes of Hercule Poirot. "Bonsoir," he said pleasantly. "I wondered if you might pay me a visit." The figure recoiled, but Poirot was already sitting up fully, his keen gaze pinning the trespasser in place. The match flickered as he lit the lamp beside him, revealing the stunned face of Charlotte Denham. She stood rooted to the spot, her breath coming in short gasps. Her wide eyes darted toward the door. Poirot tilted his head. "Come now. Mademoiselle, let us not play the game of cat and mouse. You did not expect me to be awake, n'est-ce pas?" Charlotte hesitated, then let out a small, nervous laugh. "You're impossible, Monsieur Poirot." "But of course." He gestured toward a chair. "Please, do sit. I assume you did not come merely to admire my sleeping arrangements." She hesitated once more before sinking into the chair. She clasped her hands in her lap, her fingers twisting together. Poirot studied her intently. "Now then, why have you come creeping through the halls of Whitecroft Manor in the dead of night?" Charlotte swallowed hard. I wasn't creeping." Poirot merely raised an eyebrow. She exhaled, her shoulders sagging. "I saw something. Earlier, after everyone had gone to bed, someone moving outside." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Outside? Where?" "Near the garden, by the French doors." Poirot's expression did not change, but his mind was already racing. "And did you recognize this person?" Charlotte shook her head. "No, they were careful, keeping to the shadows. But I could tell it was a man, tall, moving with purpose." Poirot tapped his fingers against his knee. "And why did you not tell the inspector?" Her lips pressed together. "Because I don't trust him. I don't trust any of them." Poirot studied her carefully. "But you trust me?" A long pause. Then finally, a small nod. Poirot sat back, steepling his fingers. "Intriguing, mademoiselle. Very intriguing indeed." Outside, the moon hung heavy in the sky, casting long shadows over the manor's grounds. Somewhere in the darkness, someone else was awake, watching, waiting. And Poirot, with his ever-active mind, knew that the night's secrets were far from over. Chapter 5. The footprints in the dew morning arrived at Whitecroft Manor with an air of unease, the chill of the previous night lingering in the corridors. The first golden slivers of sunlight filtered through the tall windows, illuminating the high ceilings and elaborate woodwork, but they did little to dispel the tension clinging to the house. At precisely 7:30, Hercule Poirot descended the grand staircase, immaculate as ever, his patent leather shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. His dark green dressing gown was exchanged for a neatly pressed grey suit, and his mustache was, as always, impeccably groomed. He moved with purpose, though he seemed in no particular hurry. In the breakfast room, the household was slowly assembling. Colonel Armitage was already seated, his face hidden behind the morning newspaper, a half-eaten slice of toast on his plate. Lady Eleanor sat stiff-backed at the table, a porcelain teacup in her hand, though she seemed more preoccupied with stirring its contents than drinking it. Charlotte Denham, looking more weary than usual, stood near the window, her fingers absently grazing the curtain. Poirot's gaze swept over the room, assessing, measuring. His conversation with Charlotte during the night remained fresh in his mind. A shadowy figure outside, a tall man, moving with purpose. Poirot seated himself with deliberate care. "Bon matin, mes amis," he greeted, lifting a slice of toast onto his plate. "I trust we all slept well." Charlotte stiffened, but said nothing. Lady Eleanor offered only a polite nod. Colonel Armitage gave a grunt. "Hardly." He folded the newspaper and set it aside. "House like this. Place is full of strange noises. Wind howling, creaks in the floorboards. Not restful, I'll say that much." Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "Ah, yes. And yet, some noises are stranger than others." Lady Eleanor looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Poirot merely smiled and took a small bite of toast. "Nothing, madame. I was merely reflecting." Before anyone could press further, Inspector Harrington strode into the room, his presence as disruptive as ever. He carried an air of smug determination, the kind that suggested he had something of importance to announce. "We have something," he declared, without preamble. Constables found footprints outside. At this, Charlotte turned away from the window. Poirot, who had expected as much, merely inclined his head. "Footprints, mon cher inspecteur. How fascinating." Harrington folded his arms. "They were in the dew, just beyond the terrace. Clear as day. They lead away from the house, towards the woods." Colonel Armitage frowned. "Woods? There's nothing out there but brambles and an old gardener's shed." Harrington smirked. "Exactly. Which means whoever it was had a reason to go there." Poirot dabbed at his lips with his napkin. "And did you follow these footprints, Inspector?" "Of course," Harrington replied. "Led right to the shed." Charlotte's voice was barely above a whisper. "And?" Harrington's smirk widened. "Door was unlocked. We went inside. Found something rather interesting." He reached into his pocket and produced a small, folded cloth. Carefully, he unwrapped it, revealing a dark, glistening object. The breakfast room collectively leaned forward. Poirot's eyes darkened. Mon Dieu. It was a knife, a thin, elegant blade, the kind used for precision rather than brute force, and on its surface, though dried now, was a faint stain of blood. "Lady." Eleanor let out a strangled gasp. Charlotte clasped a hand over her mouth. Colonel Armitage sat up straighter, his expression unreadable. Poirot, however, studied the knife with a quiet intensity. Finally, he spoke. "And you believe this to be the murder weapon?" Harrington nodded. "Looks like it, and considering we found it in the shed." He let the implication hang in the air. Poirot tapped a finger against his chin. "Curious." Charlotte, still staring at the knife, whispered, "Who would hide it there?" Harrington smirked. "That's the question, isn't it?" Poirot leaned back, his fingers steepled. "And yet, I find myself troubled, mon ami. This discovery, it is most convenient, no?" Harrington's brow furrowed. "Convenient? Oui." Poirot's voice remained measured. "You are a man of experience, Inspector. You know as well as I do that murderers do not often leave their weapons in such an obvious place." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Harrington hesitated. "So, you think it's a plant?" Poirot's lips pressed together. "I think perhaps someone wished for us to find this." Lady Eleanor let out a breath. "But why?" Poirot gave her a sharp look. "That, madame, is what we must determine." Harrington folded his arms. "Well, one thing's certain. Someone went to that shed last night, and given what we now know, I'll be questioning everyone again." His gaze swept across the room, lingering briefly on Charlotte before he turned on his heel and left. Poirot sat still for a moment, deep in thought. Then he rose, smoothing out his waistcoat. "Mademoiselle Denham," he said softly, "would you be so kind as to take a walk with me?" Charlotte hesitated, but eventually nodded. They stepped outside, into the morning air. The terrace was still damp with dew, the footprints, now marked by constables, clearly visible. Poirot followed them with his gaze, tracing the path toward the woods. Charlotte shivered slightly. "So, what does it mean?" Poirot turned to her, his gaze sharp. "It means, mademoiselle, that someone in this house is playing a most dangerous game, and they believe themselves very clever." She swallowed. "And are they?" Poirot smiled faintly. "No, because Hercule Poirot is cleverer." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the weight of a mystery, yet unsolved. The footprints had led them to a clue, but whether it was one step closer to the truth or merely another layer of deception, Poirot could not yet say, but he would. He always did. Chapter 6. Shadows of the Past. The morning mist had lifted by the time Hercule Poirot and Charlotte Denham stepped back inside Whitecroft Manor, but the unease it had carried remained thick in the air. The discovery of the blood-stained knife in the gardener's shed had cast an ominous shadow over the household, and Poirot could feel its weight pressing against each of the remaining guests. Inspector Harrington, ever the man of action, had wasted no time in summoning the household members back into the drawing room for further questioning. Poirot, with his usual measured pace, entered last, his eyes scanning the room with quiet intensity. Lady Eleanor sat rigidly in her chair, her gloved hands clasped together in her lap, though Poirot noted that her fingers fidgeted ever so slightly. Nervous habit. Colonel Armitage stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Charlotte had taken a seat near the window, her gaze distant, while Dr. Forbes, his usually jovial manner subdued, paced near the bookshelves. Harrington, positioned in the center of the room, cleared his throat. "Let's not waste time. Someone in this house has gone to great lengths to mislead us." His sharp gaze landed on each of them in turn. "The footprints, the hidden weapon, it's all meant to deceive." Poirot settled himself into an armchair. "Ah, Inspector, deception. It is the very heart of crime, n'est-ce pas?" He steepled his fingers. "But tell me, what conclusion have you drawn from these latest discoveries?" Harrington straightened. "The footprints suggest someone left the house late last night and hid the knife in the shed. But the question is, who and why?" Poirot nodded. "And yet I find myself asking, why hide the knife at all? If one wished to destroy the evidence, there are many better ways, non?" His gaze flickered towards the fireplace, where a low flame crackled. "A fire, for example, or the depths of the lake beyond the estate." Lady Eleanor's voice was clipped. "You believe someone wanted it to be found?" "Exactement." Poirot's voice was soft but certain. "And if someone wished for us to find it, then we must ask, who benefits from such a discovery?" A heavy silence settled over the room. Harrington exhaled sharply. "Well, someone's lying. We need to establish where everyone was last night. Exactly." Colonel Armitage lifted his chin. "I was in my room by 10, read for a while, slept. Poorly, but I never left." Lady Eleanor nodded. "I retired early as well. The events of the evening left me exhausted." Charlotte hesitated. I couldn't sleep. I went downstairs around midnight, just to sit in the drawing room for a while." Harrington's brow furrowed. "Alone?" She swallowed. "Yes." Poirot observed her closely. "And did you see or hear anything unusual, mademoiselle?" She hesitated. "Not then, but I heard something later. Movement outside." Harrington pounced. "When?" "Perhaps an hour later. I thought I saw a figure in the garden. It was dark, but they were moving towards the trees." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "Merci, mademoiselle." Dr. Forbes, who had been silent, finally spoke. "I was in my room all night. Asleep by 11. I heard nothing." Harrington exhaled through his nose. "Then someone is lying, because those footprints didn't appear by themselves." Poirot's gaze lingered on each face in the room before he rose to his feet. "There is one thing that troubles me, mes amis. If the footprints lead towards the woods, and the knife was found in the shed, what of the return journey?" "Colonel," Armitage frowned. "Return journey? Oui. If someone left the house to hide the knife, they must have come back. But where are those footprints?" A murmur rippled through the room. Poirot smiled faintly. "It is curious, no? Footsteps leading away but not returning, as if the culprit vanished into the night." Harrington's frown deepened. Or they had help. Poirot inclined his head. Perhaps. Silence stretched between them, heavy, with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Lady Eleanor's voice broke through, trembling slightly. "Monsieur Poirot, do you believe this crime is as simple as it appears?" Poirot's gaze softened. "Madame, no crime is ever simple. And the mind that has orchestrated this one, it is most careful indeed." Charlotte's voice was barely above a whisper. "Then how will you find the truth?" Poirot smiled, his eyes gleaming. "By following the shadows, mademoiselle. For even in the moonlight, a shadow cannot be erased." He turned to Harrington. "Inspector, I would like to examine the footprints again. I believe they have more to tell us." Harrington, though skeptical, nodded. "Very well." Poirot adjusted his cuffs and gestured for Charlotte to remain seated. "Mademoiselle, I advise you to rest. The truth, it will come soon enough." With that, he strode from the room, leaving behind a household simmering with tension. The game was far from over. But Poirot had seen the first cracks in the deception, and he would not stop until he had shattered them completely. Chapter 7. Whispers in the Fog. The evening air was thick with dampness as Hercule Poirot and Inspector E. Harrington stepped onto the terrace, the scent of rain-soaked earth filling their lungs. The sky was overcast, and though the moon struggled to break through the dense clouds, its light barely touched the sprawling gardens of Whitecroft Manor. The flickering glow from the windows behind them cast elongated shadows across the gravel path, and in the distance, an owl hooted, its cry eerie in the stillness of the night. Poirot paused at the edge of the terrace, his sharp eyes scanning the ground where the footprints had been discovered. He crouched down, running a gloved hand over the damp earth. Harrington, impatient as ever, folded his arms. "You already saw them earlier, Poirot," he grumbled. "What more can they tell us?" Poirot did not reply immediately. Instead, he studied the impressions in the soil, his head tilting slightly as if he were listening to some silent conversation between the earth and his own remarkable mind. "Mon cher," he finally murmured, "they can tell us everything." Harrington sighed. "Well?" Poirot pointed towards the faint trail of footprints leading away from the house. "These footprints, they tell the story of a person leaving the manor. But look closely, Inspector. What do you notice?" Harrington crouched beside him, squinting at the indentations. "They go in one direction, like we saw before." Poirot's lips twitched. "Ah, oui, but consider the depth, my friend. These prints are firm, evenly spaced. They belong to someone moving with certainty, someone who knows precisely where they are going." He gestured further down the trail. "Now, see how they fade? Less distinct, as if the weight upon the ground lessened." Harrington frowned. "What are you saying?" Poirot's voice was smooth as silk. "That our culprit did not return to the house the same way they left." "Which means, mon ami, they had an accomplice, or they never returned at all." Harrington straightened. "Never returned? But that would mean that they are either hiding," Poirot interjected, "or something prevented their return." The implications hung heavy between them. Harrington exhaled, rubbing his chin. "So either someone helped them escape, or they met a fate worse than arrest." Exactement. Poirot's gaze flickered toward the tree line. And yet, we found no evidence of a struggle, no body, no signs of injury. So we must ask ourselves, what if the disappearance was intentional? A rustling in the trees made Harrington tense, but Poirot remained still, listening. The wind stirred the branches, carrying a whisper through the mist-laden air. Somewhere beyond the shadows, a presence lingered. Of that Poirot was certain. Then, a voice called out from behind them. "Inspector! Monsieur Poirot!" They turned sharply, to see Charlotte Denham standing at the terrace steps, her expression a mixture of fear and urgency. "You must come at once," she gasped. "Lady Eleanor, she's been taken ill." Poirot and Harrington wasted no time, hurrying back inside the manor. Lady Eleanor was slumped in her chair in the drawing room, her face pale as porcelain. Dr. Forbes knelt beside her, pressing his fingers lightly to her wrist. A decanter and a half-filled glass sat on the table next to her, the remnants of brandy glistening in the lamplight. "She collapsed moments ago," Forbes muttered. "Her pulse is weak but steady." Poirot approached, his expression unreadable. "She drank from that glass?" Charlotte nodded. "Yes. She said she needed something to calm her nerves." Poirot lifted the glass delicately, sniffing its contents. His nostrils flared slightly, and his brows knitted together. He set it down and turned to Forbes. "Doctor, could this be poisoning?" Forbes hesitated. "Perhaps, but if so, it was subtle. No immediate convulsions, no foaming at the mouth. More like a slow-acting agent." Harrington cursed. Someone tried to silence her. Poirot's fingers tapped the table thoughtfully. Or someone wished to make it appear so. Charlotte's voice wavered. "What do you mean?" Poirot turned to face her. "Mademoiselle, we must always ask ourselves, who benefits? If Lady Eleanor were silenced now, what would it achieve? She is a woman of position, of influence. Her testimony could be damning, but it could also be manipulated." His voice lowered. "If someone wished to remove her permanently, why choose such a slow and uncertain method?" Harrington exhaled sharply. "You think she poisoned herself?" Poirot held up a hand. No. I think she was meant to appear as though she had been poisoned. Someone wanted to create chaos." A groan from Lady Eleanor drew their attention. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. What happened?" Poirot leaned forward. "Madame, can you recall anything unusual before you drank the brandy?" She frowned weakly. "No. I poured it myself. I think—" Poirot's gaze sharpened. "You think?" Her eyes flickered with confusion. No. I was given it. Someone handed me the glass, but I can't remember who." Harrington's expression darkened. "Which means someone in this room—" Poirot raised a hand. "Patience, mon ami. We must not accuse blindly." He turned back to Lady Eleanor, his voice gentler. "Madame, did anything else feel strange?" She swallowed hard, her breath unsteady. "Just before I drank, I felt light-headed, as if the room shifted." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Merci, madame. That is most interesting." Harrington was growing impatient. "You know something, Poirot. What is it?" Poirot smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Ah, Inspector, I know many things, but the answer we seek, it is not yet complete." Charlotte's hands twisted in her lap. "What do we do now?" Poirot turned his gaze toward the window, where the fog pressed against the glass. The night was far from over, and he knew, somewhere, in the darkness, the truth was waiting to be unearthed. "The game," he murmured, "is reaching its most delicate stage." He turned back to the room, his voice calm, but firm. "Mes amis, I suggest no one leaves this house tonight, for I believe that before the dawn breaks, our culprit will make another move." Chapter 8. The Midnight Betrayal, the Heir in Whitecroft. Manor was thick with tension, the lingering unease settling into every corner of the grand estate. Poirot, seated in an armchair by the fireplace, observed the faces around him with quiet intensity. The flickering flames cast deep shadows, accentuating the anxious expressions of those gathered. Lady Eleanor, though still weak, had recovered, enough to sit up, supported by Charlotte, whose nervous glances darted about the room. Inspector Harrington stood near the window, his arms crossed as he surveyed the night beyond the glass. "If what you say is true, Poirot," he said at last, "then someone in this house will act before the night is through." Poirot nodded, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Oui, mon ami. Our culprit is desperate. They have tried to silence Lady Eleanor, to create chaos, but they have failed." His eyes gleamed in the firelight. "A cornered animal, when it sees no escape, will lash out in one final reckless act." A hush fell over the room. The weight of Poirot's words settled upon the occupants like an ominous storm cloud. Somewhere in the manor, a clock chimed. Midnight. Lady Eleanor exhaled shakily. I can't believe it," she murmured. "That one of us—" She trailed off, her fingers clutching the arm of the chair. Charlotte placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We must be careful. Lady Eleanor," she whispered, "if Monsieur Poirot is right, we are in danger." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Oui, but only if we do not think as our culprit does." He turned to Harrington. "Inspector, the doors, are they secured?" Harrington nodded. "The servants have locked them all. No one's getting in or out without my knowledge." "Très bien." Poirot tapped a finger against his temple. "Then we need only wait." Minutes stretched into an hour. The oppressive silence was punctuated only by the occasional crackling of the fire. Poirot did not move, his keen eyes flicking from one suspect to another, noting every nervous twitch, every subtle shift in posture. Charlotte clenched and unclenched her hands. Lady Eleanor's breath remained shallow. Harrington tapped his foot impatiently, glancing at the clock. Then, a creak, a sound so faint, so delicate, it might have been missed by anyone less attuned to the stillness. Poirot's head turned sharply toward the far side of the room, where the heavy drapes hung beside the bookshelves. A flicker of movement. Poirot was on his feet in an instant. "Ah!" he exclaimed. "Our guest in the shadows. Do not trouble." "Yourself to hide any longer?" The drapes shifted, and from behind them a figure emerged, tall, gaunt, and unmistakably startled. It was Harold Whitmore. Harrington strode forward. "Whitmore, what the devil are you doing there?" The man's usually composed demeanor cracked for the briefest moment. He hesitated before answering. I couldn't sleep," he said at last. "I came to listen. I was curious what Monsieur Poirot would conclude." Poirot's expression was unreadable. "Curiosity, monsieur, is an interesting quality. It can lead to knowledge, or to peril." Whitmore's fingers twitched. "You don't think—" "I think, monsieur," Poirot interrupted smoothly, "that you are afraid, and fear makes men careless." Whitmore swallowed hard. "That's absurd." Before Poirot could respond, a sharp sound echoed from the hallway. Beyond, the unmistakable clatter of something falling. Every head snapped toward the closed door. Harrington pulled out his revolver. "Stay here," he ordered. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he turned to Poirot. "Or rather, perhaps—" "You'd best come with me." Poirot inclined his head. "Ah, you begin to trust my instincts, mon ami. Très bien." Together they stepped into the corridor. The grand hallway stretched before them, lined with dark wooden panels and adorned with flickering wall sconces. A long runner muffled their steps as they moved toward the source of the disturbance. Poirot's sharp gaze swept the hallway. "Do you see, Inspector?" he murmured. Harrington frowned. "See what?" Poirot gestured toward the floor. "The rug. It has been disturbed. Harrington bent down, tracing the subtle shift in the fabric. Someone ran through here in a hurry. Exactement. Poirot's voice was low. And if I am not mistaken. He turned suddenly, his gaze landing on a small silver object near the base of a nearby statue. He bent down, picking it up. Carefully. Harrington peered over his shoulder. A cufflink. Poirot examined it, his fingers running over the engraved design. A very particular one. Before they could discuss further, another noise, this time a low, pained groan, reached their ears. The two men exchanged a glance before hurrying toward the sound. They found the source at the far end of the hallway, just outside the study. A man lay sprawled across the floor, his face contorted in pain. It was Felix Ainsworth. Harrington dropped to his knees beside him. Ainsworth! What happened? The man's breath came in shallow gasps. He clutched his side, where a dark stain was spreading across his shirt. Blood. Poirot knelt beside him. Who did this, monsieur? His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Ainsworth's lips trembled. I don't know, he whispered. It was dark. A figure. They came from behind. He winced in pain. Tried to stop them. They had something metal, cold. His eyes fluttered. Poirot pressed a firm hand to his shoulder. Listen to me, monsieur. Did you see anything? Hear anything? Ainsworth struggled to focus. His fingers twitched against the carpet. Moonlight, he murmured. The moonlight caught their face. Just for a moment. Poirot leaned closer. And? Ainsworth's eyes closed. I think it was... But the words never came. His head lolled to the side, unconscious. Harrington swore under his breath. Damn it. We need to get him. Help. Poirot stood slowly, his gaze drifting toward the study door, which stood slightly ajar. No, mon ami, he said quietly. What we need is to catch the one who left him here. And with that, he stepped forward, pushing the door open to whatever awaited them beyond. Chapter 9. Shadows in the study. Poirot stepped into the study, the door creaking open to reveal a room steeped in silence. The air was thick, carrying the scent of aged books and the faintest trace of something metallic. Blood, perhaps. The fire had burned low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that stretched unnaturally across the walls. Harrington followed close behind, his revolver raised, his body taut with the expectation of another attack. The inspector's eyes swept the room quickly, assessing for any immediate threats, but the study was empty, at least at first glance. Poirot, however, did not move so quickly. His sharp eyes traced the contours of the space, absorbing the details that others might overlook. He stepped forward, his polished shoes making no sound against the thick rug. His gaze traveled from the desk, its surface slightly disturbed, to the high-backed leather chair that faced away from them, unmoving, still as death. Wait, Poirot murmured, raising a hand to halt Harrington's movement. His voice was quiet, but firm. A moment passed. Then, in the heavy silence, the chair turned ever so slightly, as if nudged by an unseen hand. Harrington stiffened, his grip on the revolver tightening. He moved forward and, with a swift motion, reached out, spinning the chair the rest of the way around. A gasp escaped him. Even Poirot's composure wavered for the briefest moment. Slumped in the chair, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, was Harold Whitmore. His eyes were half open, staring blankly, his face drained of life. A thin line of blood trailed from the corner of his mouth. His right hand rested limply on the armrest, while his left hand hung over the side, fingers curled inward as if grasping for something in his final moments. Harrington cursed under his breath. Another one, he muttered. Damn it, Poirot. We were only seconds away. The killer must still be close. Poirot, however, was not looking at the body. Instead, he stepped around the desk, his gaze fixated on the items scattered across its surface. The arrangement was peculiar, almost deliberate. The inkpot was knocked over, a pen lying just beside it. A small stack of papers had been shifted, but not in disarray. Poirot's eyes narrowed at a single sheet, placed apart from the rest. Carefully he picked it up. It was blank. Harrington, peering over his shoulder, frowned. "What is it?" Poirot turned the paper over, his fingers brushing against the surface. Then he exhaled sharply, his mustache twitching. "Ah," he murmured. "But of course." Harrington's frown deepened. "What?" Poirot glanced at him, then back to the body. "Whitmore was attempting to write something before he died," he explained, "but he did not have the strength." His voice softened. "Instead, he left us a different kind of clue." He turned to the hearth, where the embers glowed softly. Without hesitation, he lifted the blank sheet of paper and held it close to the fading heat. Slowly, faintly, letters began to emerge, scrawled in a desperate, unsteady hand. Harrington's breath caught. A hidden message. Poirot's gaze darkened as he read the words. "Moonlight reveals the truth." A silence fell between them. Harrington exhaled, shaking his head. "It's cryptic, but he must have seen something before he died. Something about the moonlight." Poirot's expression remained unreadable. He turned his attention back to Whitmore's lifeless form, then bent down, gently prying open the curled fingers of the dead man's left hand. There, nestled in his palm, was something small, something Poirot removed with delicate precision. A single pearl. Poirot studied it carefully, then placed it in his pocket. "Come, mon ami," he said at last. "We must gather everyone at once. The final act of this play is upon us." Harrington hesitated. "Do you know who it is?" Poirot gave a small, knowing smile. "I have known for some time," he admitted. "But now, I have the last proof I require." The inspector's eyes widened. "Then why didn't you—" Poirot raised a finger. "Patience, mon ami. You will see. All will be revealed in the moonlight." And with that, he turned, leaving the study and the body of Harold Whitmore behind as he prepared for the final gathering. Chapter 10. The final gathering, the drawing room of Whitmore Manor, was bathed in a pale silver glow, the moonlight streaming in through the tall windows. The fire in the hearth had been stoked, yet it could not entirely dispel the cool tension that filled the room. Every eye flickered toward the center where Hercule Poirot stood, his posture impeccable, his mustache neat and precise as ever. He had gathered them all, the remaining guests, the suspects, the ones who had woven this tangled web of lies. Inspector Harrington stood at Poirot's side, his arms folded as he surveyed the room. Beside him, Emily Langford perched on the edge of her seat, her hands clasped tightly together. Across from her, Andrew Carlyle looked paler than before, his fingers twitching as they drummed lightly on the armrest. Lady Whitmore sat stiffly, her gaze impassive, but there was something almost expectant in her posture. And then there was Evelyn Munro. Her dark eyes were unreadable, her face composed, but Poirot had long since learned to see past masks. A grandfather clock in the corner chimed the hour. Midnight. Poirot took a step forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "Mesdames, et messieurs, the time has come to bring this tragic affair to an end." Andrew let out a sharp breath. "Then you know who killed Harold?" Poirot inclined his head. "Ah, mon cher monsieur. I knew from the moment I laid eyes upon him in the study. Harold Whitmore did not die without leaving us a clue." His dark eyes swept the room. "But before we discuss that, we must first look at the events that have led us here. Let us begin at the beginning, oui. He paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. Our first tragedy was the death of Reginald Whitmore, a man found at the bottom of the cliffs, a tragic accident, or so it seemed. But, as we have now learned, Reginald Whitmore did not fall by misstep or misfortune. He was pushed. Emily let out a soft gasp, but Poirot continued without pause. At first, suspicion fell upon Mr. Carlyle, who, as we discovered, had secret business dealings with Mr. Whitmore. Dealings that, had they come to light, would have ruined him. Then, there was Lady Whitmore, who would gain much from her husband's death. He turned toward her, his sharp gaze narrowing. And yet, you were not the one who delivered the fatal push. Madame, you are guilty of many things, perhaps even a secret loathing of your husband, but not of murder. Lady Whitmore let out a slow breath, her expression revealing nothing. Poirot continued. Then we had the matter of poor Harold Whitmore, who met his fate in the very study where I first gathered my thoughts on this case. It was there that he attempted to leave us a message that, at first glance, seemed cryptic. Poirot turned toward Inspector Harrington. Do you recall what it said, mon ami? Harrington nodded grimly. Moonlight reveals the truth. Poirot smiled. Exactement. And what does that mean? A silence followed. Poirot lifted his hand and gestured toward the window. It means, my friends, that the truth was always there, hidden in plain sight, only needing the right light to expose it. His voice dropped slightly. It was Reginald Whitmore's death that set this all into motion. But why? What had he done? The answer, mes amis, lies in a single piece of jewelry. From his pocket, Poirot produced the pearl. It glistened under the chandelier's light. Evelyn Munro's fingers curled slightly, though she said nothing. This, Poirot declared, belonged to a certain woman, a woman who, long ago, had reason to despise Reginald Whitmore. Evelyn's lips parted, but Poirot raised a hand. You need not protest, mademoiselle. The time for pretenses is over. Emily's eyes darted toward Evelyn. What is he talking about? Poirot turned to her. Miss Monroe was once a woman scorned. Were you not, mademoiselle? His voice softened slightly. Reginald Whitmore ruined your family, n'est-ce pas? And so when the opportunity arose, you took your revenge. Evelyn remained silent, her face still, but her fingers trembled against the fabric of her dress. Poirot sighed. You planned his death carefully. You knew that if he was found at the bottom of the cliffs, it would be ruled an accident. And for a while it worked, but Harold Whitmore, he saw something, did he not? Poirot's gaze sharpened. Perhaps he had not realized it at first. But then, that night in the study, the memory came to him. The image of you, standing on the cliffs, watching as Reginald Whitmore fell. A muscle in Evelyn's jaw twitched. Harrington stiffened. Then Harold confronted her? Poirot nodded. Oui, and he paid for it, with his life. Emily's hands flew to her mouth. Oh, God. Poirot took another step forward. And so, Miss Monroe, the time has come to confess. Or shall I recount the rest for you? For a moment, it seemed as though she would deny it. Her lips parted slightly, her breath unsteady. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she reached up and removed the pearl earrings from her ears. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet. I never meant for him to die, she said. Not Harold, he was innocent. Poirot gave a small, solemn nod. But you did kill Reginald. A long silence stretched between them. Then, at last, Evelyn gave a single nod. The room was heavy with tension. Lady Whitmore's face was unreadable. Andrew Carlyle looked ill, and Emily was quietly weeping. Inspector Harrington exhaled, stepping forward as he reached for his handcuffs. Evelyn Munroe, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Reginald Whitmore and Harold Whitmore. Evelyn didn't resist. She merely closed her eyes as if relieved that the game was finally over. Poirot, ever composed, smoothed the lapels of his jacket. "And so the truth has come to light," he murmured. He turned toward the others, his expression unreadable. "It is a tragedy, as many crimes of passion are. But in the end, justice has found its way." As Evelyn was led away, Emily looked at Poirot, her eyes red-rimmed. "How did you know?" she whispered. Poirot gave her a small smile. "Mademoiselle, the human heart is a most fragile thing. When it is wounded, it seeks retribution. And in the moonlight, even the deepest of shadows can be revealed." And with that, Hercule Poirot turned on his heel, stepping into the cool night air, the mystery at last laid to rest.